The scent of stale coffee and betrayal hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sweet fragrance of the lilies clutched in Victoria's trembling hand. It was their 3rd anniversary, a day that had dawned with whispered promises and gentle caresses from her husband, Edward Thorne. Now standing outside the gleaming chrome and glass edifice of Thorne Holdings, a wave of nausea sharper than her usual morning sickness washed over her. It wasn't just the 6 months of pregnancy pressing on her bladder. It was a gut-wrenching premonition, a cold dread that whispered a serpent had slithered into her perfect paradise. The serpent, she would soon discover, wore a Serpensa gown and was comfortably seated in her chair. Victoria had always believed in fairy tales. How could she not? She was living in one. From a humble background working as a junior art curator, she had met Edward Thorne, the billionaire real estate magnate at a charity auction. He was older, devastatingly handsome, with eyes the color of a stormy sea that seemed to see right into her soul. He had pursued her with a relentless old-world charm, showering her with affection, respect, and a life she had only ever dreamed of. Their wedding was a lavish affair, a feature in Lux Living magazine, and their life together in their sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park was by all accounts perfect. Now 6 months pregnant with their first child, a son. Victoria felt a completeness she had never known. Edward was ecstatic, attentive, and more loving than ever. He'd personally overseen the design of the nursery, a masterpiece of soft blues and creams with a hand-painted mural of whimsical hot air balloons. He would talk to her belly for hours, telling their unborn son about the adventures they would have, the empires he would one day inherit. That morning had been no different. He'd woken her with a kiss, a single perfect red rose on her pillow, and the whispered words, "Happy anniversary, my love. Tonight we celebrate." He had a board meeting, a crucial one, he'd said, but promised to be home early for a special dinner he had planned. Victoria had spent the day in a state of blissful anticipation. She'd had a prenatal massage, bought a new, elegant maternity gown from Seraphine, and decided to surprise Edward at his office with his favorite lunch, a bespoke bento box from Nobu. She wanted to see the look on his face, that heart-stopping smile that always made her feel like the most cherished woman in the world. As she stepped out of the private elevator that opened directly into the executive suite of Thorne Holdings, she was greeted by Edward's long-suffering but impeccably polite secretary, a woman in her late 50s named Margaret. Mrs. Thorne. "What a lovely surprise," Margaret said, her smile a little tighter than usual. "Mr. Thorne is in a meeting at the moment." "Oh, I know, Victoria," said her own smile radiant. "He told me it was an important one. I just wanted to drop off his lunch. And these," she added, gesturing to the bouquet of white lilies, Edward's favorite. Margaret's eyes flickered towards the double doors of Edward's office, a flicker so brief Victoria almost missed it. "Of course. I can take them in for you." "Nonsense, Margaret. I'll just pop in for a second." "He won't mind," Victoria said, her voice light and breezy. She moved towards the doors, a sense of playful excitement bubbling within her. "Mrs. Thorne, perhaps it's best to wait." Margaret's voice was strained, a note of desperation creeping in. But Victoria was already pushing open the heavy oak doors. The scene that greeted her was one that would be seared into her memory for the rest of her life, a tableau of such profound betrayal that it stole the very breath from her lungs. The office was as grand and imposing as the man who occupied it. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a concrete jungle that Edward had conquered. His massive mahogany desk was usually a controlled chaos of files and blueprints, but today It was what was happening in front of the desk that held Victoria's horrified gaze. There in the plush, custom-made leather chair that Edward had always called Victoria's chair, the one she sat in when she visited him, the one where they'd shared countless conversations and dreams, sat a woman. Her long raven hair was styled in a sleek, sophisticated bob. She was wearing a slinky and emerald green owned by Sapensa, a dress that clung to her slender frame like a second skin. Her legs were crossed a stiletto-heeled shoe from Louboutin, dangling provocatively from her foot. And on his knees before her was her husband, Edward Thorne. His head was in her lap, his shoulders shaking with what Victoria, in her naivety first thought, was grief. The woman was stroking his hair, her long, crimson-nailed fingers tracing patterns on his scalp. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, no one moved. The bento box slipped from Victoria's numb fingers, clattering to the polished marble floor. The sound, a sharp, jarring note, in the suffocating silence, broke the spell. Edward's head shot up. His sea-storm eyes, usually filled with adoration for her, were now wide with a mixture of shock, guilt, and something else. Something Victoria couldn't quite decipher. A flicker of anger. The woman in the chair, however, showed no such discomposure. She simply tilted her head, a slow, languid movement, and a smug, triumphant smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. Victoria knew her. Of course she knew her. It was Isabella Romano, the fiercely ambitious, notoriously ruthless chief operating officer of Thorne Holdings. A woman Edward had always described as brilliant, but a shark. Victoria had met her at company galas, had exchanged polite, meaningless pleasantries with her. She had never liked her, had always felt a strange, unsettling energy from her. Now she knew why. Victoria Edward gasped, scrambling to his feet. He looked disheveled, his usually immaculate suit rumpled, his tie loosened. This isn't what it looks like. The classic, pathetic cliché hung in the air, a testament to the depth of his deceit. Victoria's gaze moved from her husband's guilty face to the woman who was now slowly, deliberately standing up. Isabella was taller than Victoria had realized, her presence commanding, her green eyes cold and assessing. She ran a hand down her dress, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle, a gesture of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Isn't it?" Isabella's voice was like honey laced with arsenic. "It looks to me like your husband was seeking a little comfort. The pressures of a multi-billion-dollar empire, you know. They can be so draining." The condescension in her tone was a physical blow. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. The lilies, once a symbol of her love and celebration, now felt like a funeral wreath in her hand. "Get out of my chair." Victoria's voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible. Isabella raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Your chair?" "Darling, this is the seat of power, and, as you can see, it's currently occupied." "Edward." Victoria's voice cracked, and she finally looked at her husband, her eyes pleading with him to deny it, to fix this, to wake her from this living nightmare. "Tell her to get out." Edward ran a hand through his hair, his face a mask of turmoil. He looked from his devastated pregnant wife to his coolly composed mistress. The silence in the room was a roaring inferno, consuming the last vestiges of Victoria's fairy tale. "Isabella Edward," finally said, his voice strained. "Perhaps you should go." Isabella let out a low, throaty laugh. "Go. But we were just getting to the good part, weren't we, Edward? The part where you tell me how you're going to leave this relic of a marriage, and finally be with a woman who understands your world, your ambition. That's enough. Edward snapped a flash of anger in his eyes, but the damage was done. The words once spoken could not be unsaid. They hung in the air, venomous and irrefutable. Victoria felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her abdomen. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly. The room began to spin, the panoramic view of the city blurring into a kaleidoscope of mocking lights. Victoria Edward cried out, taking a step towards her. "Don't touch me," she whispered, the words laced with a pain so profound it was almost a physical force. She took a step back, then another, her eyes never leaving his. She saw him not as the man she loved, the father of her child, but as a stranger, a liar, a betrayer. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she turned and fled. She didn't hear Edward calling her name, didn't hear Isabella's derisive laughter. The only sound was the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart, a drum beat marking the end of her world. She stumbled out of the office past a horrified Margaret, who rushed to her side. "Mrs. Thorne, are you all right?" "Let me call someone." But Victoria shook her head, pushing past her. She ran towards the elevator, her breath coming in ragged sobs. As the doors slid shut, she caught a final glimpse of Edward standing in the doorway of his office, his face a portrait of despair. But it was too late. The glass had shattered the pieces, too small, too sharp, to ever be put back together again. The fairy tale was over, and in its place a brutal, unforgiving reality had begun. The reality of a pregnant wife, a cheating husband, and a mistress who had not only stolen her man, but had also dared to sit in her chair. A war had been declared in that opulent office, and Victoria, with her unborn child as her only ally, knew she had to fight back. The naive girl who believed in fairy tales was gone. In her place, a woman scorned and determined was slowly, painfully being born. The elevator descended a metallic cage, plummeting Victoria back to a world that no longer made sense. Each floor it passed was a layer of her life being stripped away. The penthouse, their home, now felt like a gilded cage. The future she had so carefully, so lovingly built with Edward was now a pile of rubble at her feet. She stumbled out into the bustling lobby of Thorne Holdings, a ghost in a designer maternity dress. The security guards, men who usually greeted her with deferential smiles, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and confusion. She ignored them, pushing her way through the revolving doors and out into the jarring noise of the city. The cacophony of sirens' horns and the endless chatter of people was a stark contrast to the deafening silence in her heart. She didn't know where she was going. She just walked her feet, carrying her aimlessly through the crowded streets of Manhattan. The city that had once felt like a playground now felt like a labyrinth, each corner a reminder of a memory, now tainted by betrayal. A bistro, where they'd had their first date, a park where he had proposed a theater, where they'd shared their first public kiss. Each memory was a fresh stab of pain. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her purse. Edward. The name on the screen, once a source of comfort and joy, now ignited a fresh wave of nausea. She ignored it, letting the calls go to voicemail, each missed call a small act of defiance, a tiny reclaiming of her shattered self. Finally, her legs gave out. She found herself in front of a small independent art gallery in Soho, a place she hadn't visited since her life had been consumed by the whirlwind that was Edward Thorne. It was a world away from the high-stakes, high-society art auctions she now frequented. This was a place of raw, unpolished talent, a place where art was a passion, not an innocent. She went inside, the familiar scent of oil paint and turpentine, a strangely comforting balm to her wounded soul. The gallery owner, a kind-faced bohemian woman named Clara, who had been a mentor to Victoria in her early career, looked up from her desk. Victoria. "My goodness, it's been too long," Clara said, her smile warm and genuine. But then she saw Victoria's face, the tear-streaked mascara, the haunted look in her eyes. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of deep concern. "My dear, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. "I've seen the truth." And there, amidst the canvases of aspiring artists, the story of her perfect life's ugly underbelly came pouring out. She told Clara everything. The anniversary, the surprise, the scene in the office, the woman in her chair, the smug smile, the devastating words. She spoke until she was hoarse, until the tears had run dry, leaving behind a hollow ache in her chest. Clara listened patiently, her expression a mixture of sympathy and a quiet, simmering anger. When Victoria had finished, Clara took her hand, her touch firm and grounding. "Men like Edward Thorne," Clara said, her voice filled with a weary wisdom. "They build empires of glass and steel, but their hearts are often made of something far more fragile, far more corruptible. And women like Isabella Romano, they are the vultures who circle those empires, waiting for a moment of weakness." "What do I do?" Clara Victoria asked, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "I have nothing. My life, my home, my future. It was all tied to him." "You have yourself, Victoria," Clara said fiercely, "and you have that precious life inside you. That is not nothing. That is everything." Clara's words, simple yet profound, resonated deep within Victoria. For the first time since she had fled that office, a tiny spark of something other than despair flickered within her. It was a spark of anger, of a fight she didn't know she had in her. Meanwhile, back at Thorne Holdings, Edward was in a state of frantic panic. After Victoria had fled, he had turned on Isabella. His voice, a low, dangerous snarl. "Get out," he had said, his face pale with a mixture of fury and fear. Isabella, for the first time, looked taken aback. She had expected a different reaction. She had expected him to finally decisively choose her. "Edward, darling," she had purred, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is a blessing in disguise. Now we can be together openly." Together, Edward had laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "There is no us. There was never going to be an us. You were a diversion, a mistake." The words hit Isabella like a slap in the face. Her carefully constructed composure crumbled, revealing the raw, wounded pride beneath. "A mistake? I am not a mistake, Edward. I am your equal. I am the one who understands you, who challenges you. Not that simpering little doll you married. Don't you dare talk about her." Edward had roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous office. "You don't know the first thing about her." "I know that she's weak." Isabella had spat back her eyes, flashing with a venomous fire. "And I know that you will come crawling back to me. You always do." With that, she had stormed out of his office, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and shattered promises. Now alone in his office, the silence was a suffocating blanket. He looked at the spilled bento box, the scattered lilies, the symbols of his wife's love, now ruined on the floor. A wave of self-loathing washed over him so intense it almost brought him to his knees. What had he done? He had betrayed the one person who had loved him unconditionally, the one person who had brought light and warmth into his cold, sterile world. He called her phone again and again, each unanswered call a fresh twist of the knife in his gut. He called her friends, her mother, but no one had seen her. He was a man who could track a stock market fluctuation in real time, a man who could predict the rise and fall of global economies. But he couldn't find his own wife. He felt a helplessness that was entirely foreign to him, a terrifying void, where his usual confidence and control used to be. He didn't know it yet, but the storm that was gathering was far bigger than a marital spat. Isabella, her pride wounded and her ambitions thwarted, was not a woman to be trifled with. She had been his confidant, his partner in ambition, and his lover. She knew his secrets, his vulnerabilities, his every weakness. And she was not about to go down without a fight. She had a plan, a contingency for every eventuality. And the humiliation she had just suffered had just activated her most ruthless one yet. And Victoria, cocooned in the quiet sanctuary of Clara's art gallery, was also undergoing a transformation. The tears had been shed. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by old, hard clarity. She had been a fool, a naive girl playing dress-up in a world she didn't understand. But she was also a mother-to-be, and the fierce, primal instinct to protect her child was now a roaring fire in her veins. She looked at Clara, her eyes no longer filled with despair, but with a steely resolve. He's not going to get away with this, Clara. He thinks I'm weak. They both do, but they have no idea who they're dealing with. The battle lines had been drawn. On one side, a billionaire consumed by guilt and a desperate need for redemption. On the other, a scorned mistress armed with secrets and a thirst for revenge. And in the middle, a pregnant wife who had just discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. The storm was coming, and when it broke, it would threaten to destroy not just a marriage, but an entire world. The drama was just beginning, and the players were about to find out that hell hath no fury, like a woman and a mother scorned. The next few days were a blur of calculated moves and quiet desperation. Victoria, with Clara's help, found a small, discreet apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a far cry from the opulent penthouse that now felt like a mausoleum of broken dreams. She changed her number, creating a digital fortress around herself, a space where Edward's incessant calls and apologetic texts could not penetrate. She also made a crucial call, one that would set the stage for the battle to come. She called Arthur Vance, the most feared divorce lawyer in the city, a man known for his razor-sharp intellect and his take-no-prisoners approach to litigation. Mrs. Thorne. Arthur's voice was calm and measured over the phone. "I've been expecting your call." Victoria was taken aback. "You have?" When a man like Edward Thorne, a man with a net worth that rivals a small country's GDP, has a public indiscretion, the vultures start to circle. I, however, prefer to be the eagle. Victoria felt a flicker of hope. "I need your help, Mr. Vance. I want to leave him, but I want to do it on my own terms." "And what are your terms, Mrs. Thorne?" "I want to be financially independent," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I want to secure my son's future. And I want to make sure that Isabella Romano does not profit from my pain." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Arthur Vance let out a low chuckle. "Mrs. Thorne, I do believe this is the beginning of a beautiful and very profitable partnership." Arthur's first piece of advice was simple, but powerful. Do not engage with him. Do not answer his calls. Do not respond to his messages. Let him stew in his own guilt. A desperate man makes mistakes, and we will be there to capitalize on every single one of them. And so Victoria began her new life in the shadows, a life of quiet determination. She started visiting the art gallery again, not as a patron, but as a collaborator. She began to use her knowledge of the art world, her eye for talent, to help Clara curate a new exhibition. The work was a welcome distraction, a way to channel her pain and anger into something productive, something that was hers, and hers alone. Meanwhile, Edward was a man on the brink. The silence from Victoria was a form of torture he had never experienced. He was used to getting what he wanted, to solving problems with a phone call or a checkbook. But this was different. This was a wound he couldn't close, a chasm he couldn't bridge. His work suffered. He was distracted, irritable, his Midas touch seemingly deserting him. He made a series of uncharacteristically poor business decisions, his mind clouded by the personal turmoil that consumed him. The board of Thorne Holdings, a group of powerful, ruthless men who cared more about profit margins than personal problems, were starting to get nervous. And then there was Isabella. After her dramatic exit from his office, she had become a ghost. She still came to work, her performance as impeccable as ever. But the easy camaraderie, the late-night brainstorming sessions, the stolen moments of intimacy, they were all gone. She was a block of ice, her green eyes holding a chillingly professional distance. She was playing a waiting game, and Edward, for all his business acumen, couldn't figure out her next move. He tried to apologize, to explain. He cornered her in her office one evening, his voice pleading. "Isabella, we need to talk." She looked up from her computer, her expression unreadable. "There's nothing to talk about, Edward. We had a professional relationship that crossed a line. It's over. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a quarterly report to finalize." Her coldness was more unnerving than any outburst of anger. He had underestimated her pride, her ambition, her capacity for revenge. The first move in Isabella's game of chess came a week later. An anonymous tip was leaked to a notorious gossip columnist, a man named Marco Diaz, whose online portal, The Diaz Report, was the scourge of the city's elite. The tip was simple, yet devastatingly effective. Edward Thorne, the golden boy of New York real estate, was having an affair with his COO, the formidable Isabella Romano. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, and it spread like wildfire. The headlines were salacious, the details embellished, but the core of the story was true. And it was enough to send shockwaves through the city's financial district. The board of Thorne Holdings called an emergency meeting. The company's stock, which had already been faltering due to Edward's erratic behavior, took a nosedive. The scandal was a breach of the company's code of conduct, a PR nightmare that threatened to tarnish the carefully crafted image of Thorne Holdings. Edward found himself in the crosshairs, his personal life suddenly the subject of intense public scrutiny. He was hounded by paparazzi, his every move documented, his every expression analyzed. The man who had once been the king of the city was now its most celebrated villain. In her quiet apartment, Victoria read the news with a strange sense of detachment. She had expected, it had known that Isabella would not go down quietly. But seeing the sordid details of her husband's betrayal laid bare for the world to see was a fresh wave of pain. "This is her doing," Victoria said to Arthur Vance over the phone, her voice cold and hard. "Of course it is," Arthur replied, his tone unflappable. "This is a classic scorched earth tactic. She's trying to devalue the company to create chaos. She's probably hoping that the board will oust Edward and put her in his place." "Will they?" Victoria asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "They might," Arthur admitted. "Which is why we need to make our move. The prenup you signed, it's ironclad, but it also has a morality clause, and your husband has just violated it in the most public way imaginable. So what does that mean?" "It means we have leverage, Mrs. Thorne. It means we can go after more than just the standard settlement. We can go after a piece of the pie. A very big piece." Arthur's plan was audacious. A masterstroke of legal maneuvering. He filed for divorce on Victoria's behalf, citing adultery and emotional distress. But he also filed an injunction, a move that would freeze a significant portion of Edward's personal assets, and more importantly, a portion of his shares in Thorne Holdings. The injunction sent a shockwave through the company, a move far more damaging than the gossip column headlines. It signaled to the board, to the shareholders, that this was not just a messy divorce. This was a hostile takeover bid, orchestrated by the scorned wife of their CEO. Edward was blindsided. He had expected a quiet, dignified divorce, a generous settlement, a clean break. He had not expected this. He had not expected his sweet, gentle Victoria to have this much fight in her. He called her, his voice a mixture of anger and desperation. This time she answered. Her voice was cool, calm, and utterly devoid of the warmth he so desperately missed. "Victoria, what are you doing?" "An injunction. You're going to destroy the company. You did that yourself." "Edward," she replied, her voice steady. "You and Isabella. I'm just protecting my son's future. Our son, Victoria. Our son. You forfeited your right to say 'our' when you knelt before another woman in my chair." She said the words sharp and precise. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. He had no response, no defense. She had checkmated him. The first move had been made. Victoria, the pawn in this game of power and betrayal, had just transformed into a queen. She had taken control of the board, had thrown the king and his treacherous knight into a state of disarray. The war was far from over. In fact, it had just begun, and as the dust settled from this first explosive move, one thing was clear. Victoria Thorne was not going down without a fight. She was going to burn his kingdom to the ground, and from the ashes build an empire of her own. The injunction was a masterstroke. It sent the board of Thorne Holdings into a tailspin. With a significant portion of Edward's shares, frozen, his control over the company he had built from the ground up was suddenly precarious. The vultures, as Arthur Vance had so eloquently put it, began to circle. Board members who had once been loyal allies now saw an opportunity, a power vacuum waiting to be filled. And at the center of this burgeoning chaos was Isabella Romano. The scandal she had orchestrated had backfired in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had intended to weaken Edward, to make him vulnerable to force the board's hand. She had not expected Victoria to retaliate with such a devastatingly effective legal maneuver. The injunction not only hurt Edward, it hurt the company, and by extension, it hurt her. She found herself in a precarious position. The board, while wary of Edward, was also deeply suspicious of her. They saw her as the catalyst for the crisis, a liability that threatened the stability of the entire enterprise. Her dream of taking the CEO's chair was slipping through her fingers. Desperate to regain control, Isabella made her next move, a move born of hubris and a chilling lack of morality. She decided to leak another story to Marco Diaz, a story that would not only discredit Victoria, but would also paint Edward as a victim, a man manipulated by a gold-digging, unstable wife. The story that appeared in the Diaz report was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. It painted Victoria as a social climber who had trapped Edward into marriage by getting pregnant. It hinted at a history of emotional instability, of irrational jealousy, of a woman who was using her pregnancy as a weapon to extort a fortune from her long-suffering husband. The article was a brutal character assassination, and it hit Victoria like a physical blow. To see her love for Edward, her joy over her pregnancy twisted into something so ugly, so venal, was a violation that cut deeper than the initial betrayal. The public, ever fickle, began to turn. The narrative shifted. Victoria, the wronged wife, was now a manipulative shrew. Edward, the cheating husband, was now a tragic figure, a man trapped in a toxic marriage. This is a declaration of war. Arthur Vance said, his voice grim, as he read the article aloud to Victoria in his office. She's not just trying to win a divorce settlement. She's trying to destroy you. Victoria, who had been so strong, so resolute, felt herself begin to crumble. The constant stress, the public humiliation, the weight of her pregnancy, it was all becoming too much. "I don't know if I can do this, Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I feel like I'm drowning." "You are not going to drown. Mrs. Thorne," Arthur said, his voice firm. "You are going to swim, and I am going to be the shark that swims alongside you." Arthur's team of investigators began to dig into Isabella's past, searching for any skeletons in her closet, any leverage they could use to fight back. And what they found was more shocking, more damning than they could have ever imagined. Isabella Romano, the self-made woman, the brilliant COO, had a secret, a very big secret. She had a daughter, a child. She had given up for adoption years ago, a child she had erased from her life in her relentless pursuit of power and success. The revelation was a bombshell. It was the ultimate hypocrisy. A woman who had painted Victoria as a manipulative mother was herself an absentee one. "This is it," Arthur said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "This is the silver bullet." But Victoria hesitated. To use a child, an innocent in this sordid affair, felt wrong. It felt like stooping to Isabella's level. "I don't want to hurt her child," Victoria said, her hand instinctively going to her own belly. "This isn't about hurting the child," Arthur argued. "This is about exposing the hypocrisy of the woman who is trying to destroy you. This is about leveling the playing field." Victoria was torn. But then she thought about her own child, about the world. He would be born into a world where his mother was being vilified, his father's legacy in tatters. She thought about the cold, calculating cruelty of Isabella Romano, and her resolve hardened. "Do it," she said, her voice a whisper. The story of Isabella's secret daughter was leaked not to the salacious Marco Diaz, but to a respected, serious journalist at the New York Times. It was a strategic move designed to lend credibility to the story, to frame it not as gossip, but as a serious investigation into the character of a high-powered executive. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Isabella. The story, a deeply researched and sensitively written piece, painted a picture of a woman so consumed by ambition that she had sacrificed the most fundamental human connection. The public, which had been so quick to condemn Victoria, now turned on Isabella with a vengeance. She was no longer the brilliant, wronged woman. She was a monster, a modern-day Medea. The board of Thorn Holdings, already on edge, saw their worst fears realized. Isabella was not just a liability, she was a toxic asset. In a swift, unanimous decision, they terminated her contract, citing a breach of the company's ethics clause. Isabella was ruined. Her career, her reputation, her carefully constructed life. It was all gone. She had played with fire, and she had been consumed by the flames. Edward, watching this all unfold, was a man in turmoil. He felt a grim satisfaction at Isabella's downfall, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of guilt. He had created this monster, had fed her ambition, had been complicit in her rise, and he had allowed her to hurt Victoria in the most brutal way imaginable. He knew he had to do something to atone for his sins, to try and salvage some semblance of the man he once was. He called a press conference, a move that stunned his lawyers and the board of Thorn Holdings. He stood before the cameras, not as the powerful CEO, but as a broken man. He confessed everything: the affair, the lies, the deceit. He took full responsibility for his actions, for the pain he had caused his wife, for the chaos he had unleashed upon his company. He announced that he was taking an indefinite leave of absence from Thorn Holdings, that he was going to focus on his personal life, on trying to earn back the trust of the woman he loved. It was a stunning, unprecedented act of public contrition. It was also a brilliant strategic move. By falling on his own sword, he had preempted any further attacks, had taken the wind out of the sails of his detractors. He had, in a single act of humility, begun the long, arduous process of rebuilding his life and his reputation. Victoria watched the press conference from her apartment, her heart a tumultuous mix of emotions. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse in his voice. But she also saw the man who had shattered her world, the man who had stood by while another woman sat in her chair. The war was not over, but the battlefield had shifted. Isabella was gone. Edward was humbled, and Victoria, the pregnant wife who had walked into her husband's office and found her life in ruins, was now in a position of unimaginable power. The future of Thorn Holdings, the fate of the man she had once loved, was now in her hands. The unraveling was complete, and from the wreckage, a new uncertain future was about to be born. Edward's public confession was a detonation at the heart of New York's elite society. It wasn't just news, it was a spectacle. The king had willingly abdicated, stripping himself of his crown and armor before the ravenous eyes of the world. For Victoria, watching the broadcast from the quiet solitude of her new apartment, the moment was a tangled knot of emotions. There was no triumphant joy, only a hollow, echoing vindication. He had finally spoken the truth, but the words were a ghost of what she had needed to hear in the sanctity of their life, not in a press conference staged to salvage a crumbling empire. Heeding the advice of his few remaining advisors, Edward vanished. He retreated to the sprawling Thorn estate in the Hamptons, a place he hadn't willingly visited since his father's funeral. The magnificent cedar-shingled mansion, usually a hub of summer galas, was now a cavernous hall of silence. He wandered its empty rooms, the sea air thick with the scent of salt and regret. He'd find himself standing in his father's old study, surrounded by leather-bound books on ethics and philosophy books he'd once dismissed as relics of a bygone era. He saw the man. His father was stern, principled, a builder of legacies, not just fortunes. The reflection that stared back at him from the darkened windows was a pale, haunted stranger. This self-imposed exile wasn't a vacation. It was a penance, a desperate, lonely attempt to find the man he was supposed to be, the man Victoria had once believed him to be. Back in Manhattan, the power vacuum at Thorn Holdings had become a vortex. The emergency boardroom was a theater of barely concealed panic. Loyalties once forged in steel and sealed over expensive steak dinners were now brittle as glass. Whispers of hostile takeovers and shareholder revolts slithered through the corridors. They were a ship without a captain taking on water, and the sharks were circling. "We're hemorrhaging value," grumbled Lawrence Mead, a portly, perpetually sweating board member who had been with the company for 3 decades. Edward's mea culpa was a disaster. He made us look weak, rudderless. What he made us look like is what we are countered another, a younger, sharper executive named Chen. This rot started at the top. The Isabella Romano affair proves it. It was into this den of circling wolves that Arthur Vance made his move. He requested a formal audience for his client Victoria Thorn with the full board of directors. The request was met with incredulity, then suspicion. "What does she want?" Mead demanded over a conference call. "To bleed us dry. To stand over the corporate corpse and pick the bones clean. We're legally obligated to hear her out." Arthur's voice had cut through the static, cool and sharp as a scalpel. "And I assure you, gentlemen, you'll want to hear what she has to say." Desperate for any semblance of a lifeline. They agreed. The days leading up to the meeting were a crucible for Victoria. The public humiliation of Isabella's articles had left scars, and the thought of facing that room of powerful, judgmental men was terrifying. Doubts gnawed at her in the quiet hours of the night. "I can't do this, Clara," she confessed one evening, her hands resting on her burgeoning belly as if to draw strength from the life within. "I'm a curator, not a CEO. They'll eat me alive." Clara, ever her anchor, took Victoria's hands. "They'll expect the weeping wife. They'll expect a victim. You will not give them that. You will give them the mother of this company's future. You are not fighting for yourself, Victoria. You are fighting for Theo." The name, the one they had chosen for her son, was a talisman. With Arthur coaching her on corporate law and Clara bolstering her spirit, Victoria prepared. She pored over financial reports, market analyses, and blueprints for stalled projects. She discovered a fire in her belly. She never knew she had an intellectual curiosity and a strategic mind that had been lulled to sleep by a life of comfortable luxury. She was not just Edward Thorn's wife anymore. She was becoming herself. The day of the meeting, she chose her armor with care, a simple, elegant navy blue dress that didn't hide her pregnancy, but framed it with dignity, a single strand of her grandmother's pearls, her only adornment. Flanked by Arthur and Clara, she walked into the boardroom on the 50th floor of Thorn Tower. The air was thick with tension and expensive cologne. A dozen pairs of eyes, ranging from skeptical to openly hostile, tracked her every move as she took her place at the head of the long mahogany table in the very seat Edward used to occupy. Lawrence Mead looked at her as if she were an insect to be squashed. She let the silence hang for a moment, meeting each of their gazes, her own calm and unwavering. Then she began to speak. Her voice, clear and steady, filled the room. She did not mention the affair. She did not speak of betrayal. She spoke of legacy. For 50 years, she began, Thorne Holdings has been a titan of industry, a symbol of New York's ambition. But in recent months, we have lost our way. We have prioritized profit over principle, expansion over ethics. The foundation my father-in-law built has been compromised not by market forces, but by a moral deficit. She laid out a vision that stunned them into silence. She spoke of pivoting towards sustainable green architecture, of creating community partnerships in the neighborhoods they developed, of establishing a transparent corporate culture where integrity was not just a word in a mission statement, but a measurable metric. She presented detailed proposals, cost-benefit analyses, and a clear 5-year plan. She wasn't emotional. She was surgical, informed, and utterly convincing. Lawrence Meade, unable to contain his disdain, finally interrupted. This is all very idealistic, Mrs. Thorne. But this is the real world. What exactly do you want from us? A bigger settlement? A conscience fund? Victoria met his condescending gaze without flinching. What I want, Mr. Meade, is the future. She rose slowly, her presence commanding the room. The shares that are currently frozen under the injunction represent a significant stake in this company. My son, the heir to the Thorne name, will one day inherit those shares. I am here today, not to tear this company down, but to rebuild it. I am here to protect my son's birthright. The room was silent. The mention of her son, the undisputed heir, shifted the power dynamic completely. I have no desire to be CEO, she continued, delivering her masterstroke. But I will be taking a seat on this board. From that position, I will oversee the implementation of this new vision. And I have a candidate to propose for CEO Daniel Chen, a man of integrity, experience, and a man who I know has the respect of this room. Chen, the young executive, looked utterly shocked. Then a slow look of understanding and respect dawned on his face. Victoria had not just come with a plan. She had come with an alliance. She had outmaneuvered every single one of them. The vote, when it was called, was a mere formality. It was unanimous. Victoria Thorne had walked into the lion's den and emerged its leader. News travels fast in the world of high finance. In the Hamptons, Edward received a call from a shell-shocked Lawrence Meade. He listened, his knuckles white, as he gripped the phone, as Meade recounted the events of the meeting. When the call ended, Edward didn't feel anger. He didn't feel resentment. He felt a profound, humbling awe. The gentle, art-loving woman he had married, the woman he had so carelessly betrayed and underestimated, had just saved his father's legacy from his own foolishness. She hadn't destroyed his kingdom. She had fortified it, remade it in her own stronger image. A few weeks later, as the first crimson leaves of autumn began to fall, Victoria gave birth to Theodore Theo Thorne. Holding him for the first time, she felt a peace that washed away the last vestiges of the storm. All the pain, all the fighting, it had all led to this perfect, tiny miracle in her arms. Edward heard the news from Arthur Vance, a single formal text message. He drove back to the city, a man hollowed out by guilt and electrified by a fragile, terrifying hope. He found her in a standard room in the maternity ward, the glittering city skyline, a backdrop to a scene of quiet intimacy. He paused in the doorway, a ghost at the feast. She wasn't wearing seraphine or surrounded by lavish bouquets. She was just Victoria, holding their son. Her face illuminated by a soft lamp, radiating a strength and serenity that took his breath away. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger in them, but no welcome either. Just a quiet, guarded stillness. He took a hesitant step into the room, his expensive shoes silent on the linoleum floor. "He's beautiful," he whispered, his voice cracking the words, feeling hopelessly inadequate. "Yes," Victoria replied, her voice soft but firm, her gaze shifting back to the baby in her arms. "He is." She didn't ask him to come closer. She didn't offer for him to hold his son. The space between them was a chasm miles wide and fathoms deep, filled with the wreckage of their past. Edward stood there, a king in exile, looking at the two people who were his entire world, knowing he had no right to either of them. The reckoning was over. The drama had faded. This quiet, painful, uncertain moment was all that was left. It was not an ending. It was the first terrifying day of a long, arduous journey toward a dawn he could only pray he would one day be worthy enough to see. The story of Victoria Thorne is a stark reminder that the deepest betrayals can often forge the most unbreakable strength. We've journeyed with her from the dizzying heights of a fairy tale life to the crushing depths of heartbreak, and watched as she rose from the ashes, not as a victim, but as a victor. Her fight was not just for herself, but for the future of her unborn child, a testament to the fierce, unyielding power of a mother's love. But the question remains, can a love so brutally shattered ever be truly mended? Can Edward, a man stripped of his pride, ever truly earn redemption in Victoria's eyes, and in our own? If Victoria's journey of resilience and rebirth has moved you, if the drama of the Thorne Empire has captivated you, please show your support. Like this video, share it with others who appreciate a story of strength against all odds, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of love loss and the indomitable human spirit. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to light. What do you think Victoria should do next? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.